I'm Autumn Lockett.
And this is Mitch Randall.
And you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Autumn and I are going to catch up after being away for a few weeks. And then later on in the pod, I'm going to sit down with Tim Alberta, who is a staff writer for The Atlantic magazine. He recently wrote an article entitled How Politics Poisoned the Evangelical Church. And he and I have a fascinating discussion about what's going on with the religious right these days. So it's going to be a good pod. Stay tuned.
Arms folded, feet pacing the floor. It's written all over your face. The body doesn't hide our true feelings. It disregards promises made to keep the peace or just keep it to ourselves. I'm Reverend Starlette Thomas, host of the Raceless Gospel podcast from Good Faith Media. We're giving our listeners a hand when discerning body language. That's our focus in Season 3. The church is called the body of Christ, so what does our body language say about perennial and pressing hot-button issues? What's costing us an arm and a leg? Who do we give the cold shoulder and keep at arm's length? When have we put our foot in our mouth or turned a blind eye? Why are we still sitting on our hands? Where do we toe the line? And why is the kingdom that is coming not on the tip of our tongues? In Season 3 of the Raceless Gospel podcast, we'll address these questions in 8 episodes, and I hope you'll be all ears. The Raceless Gospel podcast is looking at body language. I'm your podcast pastor, Reverend Starlette Thomas. Episode 1 drops on May 5th. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Aloha, Autumn.
Aloha, Mitch. It means hello and goodbye.
Well, I'm saying hello this time.
Did you know that?
I did know that, actually.
And I also learned aloha mahalo, which means hello, thank you, or goodbye, thank you.
Well,
and they sort of like run it all together.
Oh, well, you were away on one of our experiences to the Big Island in Hawaii. So tell us, how was it? Did you have the time of your life?
I did not want to come home. I did not want to come home. It was amazing. The people who we traveled with were so diverse. One of my favorite one of my favorite stories that came out of Hawaii was a woman who found us she lives in Oregon and found us through Facebook and started reading our articles and said, who are these people? Like, what? They love Jesus, but they also love social justice. And they're like, she said, you guys just kept talking about the things that were the most pressing on my heart. And so she sort of joined up with us there and saw us talking about going on these experiences. And she was like, well, I'm going to go. She didn't know one of us, not one of us.
That's amazing.
And I mean, we've been texting still since we're back. I mean, she's just dear. And then we have some folks who this was their fourth trip with us, their fourth experience with Good Faith Media. So a pretty good blend, different ages, different stages, different activity levels. And it was just so nice to get away and live in a bubble of literal rainbows and waves and volcanoes, and what a gift. It was amazing.
Well, I've been keeping up with your social media, not only at Good Faith Media, but as your individual site as well. And you were posting some amazing photos throughout the week. So what was your favorite experience during this trip?
That is so tough because there are so many amazing things.
Well, top two. How's that top two?
My top two. Okay. I think seeing lava glow from a volcano. I mean, I can remember being a little girl and watching Reading Rainbow and LeVar Burton going to Hawaii and talking about the different kinds of lava and talking about volcanoes. So have sort of been captivated by volcanoes since I was little and getting to see one. It was actually erupting while we were there. So we got to see the glow one night, which was just incredible. And then we had a small group of folks who went to a beach on the last full day there and just swimming in the ocean and just sort of having a moment where your phone was nowhere near you. That's the beautiful thing about these experiences is you kind of have to wait till you're on Wi-Fi to do anything because these national parks are famously unplugged.
Sure.
But when you're in the ocean, you can't even be taking pictures. It's just you and just remembering that there is still beauty in this world that has been so ugly lately and unfortunately continued to be ugly while we were gone in our little Hawaii bubble.
You're absolutely right. Well, for anybody who's interested in taking one of our experience trips, we still have one that is open, and that is this summer to the Pacific Northwest. They can still sign up for it, right? I know time is...
We have a few seats left, yes.
Got a few seats left. If you're interested in joining our group to go up to the Pacific Northwest and to explore the beauty that is Oregon, we would love to have you. So go to goodfaithmedia.org, click on experiences, and you can find out more about that. So I'm glad you had a good time, Autumn.
I'm told there will be orcas involved.
Oh, wow.
I know. And not in SeaWorld. Like actually in the... Okay, I'm going to talk speedy quick about... We were swimming at one point. We were kind of waiting in some of the tide pools, and sea turtles are just like swimming beside us. It wasn't like one of these like commercial, like, come swim with the sea turtles. No, we were just in the water, and the sea turtles are like, hey man, what's up? Swimming by. I mean, just amazing experiences. And that's what you get when you travel with Bruce, who's our experiences guide. I mean, he just knows the best places to go, when to make the dinner reservations to see lava glow. Like, he will not lead you wrong. So absolutely worth the time and money.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned that you lived in a bubble for a while, and that is true because those of us who were in the lower 48, as they call them,
the upper 48.
Well, it's the upper 48. That's right, in Hawaii. I've been going through a lot since the last time you and I sat down and talked about what was going on in the world. That was right on the heels, I think, of the massacre in Buffalo at the shopping center. There's several great pieces at goodfaithmedia.org on that. Starlet Thomas does a great job talking about what it meant to her as someone who grew up in Buffalo, and her mom is still a resident there, and that's where the grocery shop, or that's where she shops for her groceries. And then later on, we had the horrible massacre again in Uvalde, Texas, at the elementary school, at Robb Elementary School there in Uvalde. And then just this week, here in our home state of Oklahoma, a gunman walked into St. Francis Hospital in Tulsa and killed 4 individuals before turning the gun on himself. So, Autumn, this has got to be a watershed moment. I mean, we keep saying this year after year after year.
The Sandy Hook of it all, though, Mitch.
Right. I mean, if, we didn't do anything significant after Sandy Hook, some state legislatures did that were more progressive in their thinking towards sensible gun restrictions. But a lot of the other states did not. We did nothing federally. It's time. It is absolutely time. It's
past time.
We've got a gun problem here in the United States. The church has a gun problem because it seems as though they worship gun ownership more than they follow the scriptures. Because I've talked till I'm blue in the face what the scripture says about violence and the use of violence. We get arguments all the time. Well, Jesus says, if you don't have a sword, go buy one and pick one up. Well, yeah, he did say that. But then just verses later in the Gospel of Luke, he tells those same disciples, put the sword down. This is not the way. And so it is very clear in Scripture, as far as Jesus is concerned, how we should interact as people of faith and how we should live and treat violence and weaponry. And this ain't it. We've got to do something.
No, it's really not it. It was so hard. Yes, I was in a bubble and we were far away, but I was also far away from my kids. And hearing that story, as it unfolded and not being able to get to my kids and knowing they were still in school for like 3 more days after that happened, and just that pit in your stomach of, are they safe? And the answer is no. They're absolutely not safe.
No,
they're not
safe.
None of us are.
Yeah. Both of my boys are adults now. One's out of college. One is going into his senior year in college. But, there was a time in high school where my youngest, they went into a lockdown, and he was actually outside throwing some trash away for a teacher, and he couldn't get inside, and he didn't know what was going on. And it really freaked him out. It was terrifying for him. because they were on lockdown and he was stuck outside and he didn't know what was going to happen. And, you know, it's not only the trauma of each one of these events. I mean, the loss of life is the ultimate tragedy in any of these, but the trauma that we are putting these kids through almost on a weekly basis as they have to do, intruder drills now, and they always have to be constantly aware and constantly on edge. What if a gunman walks into my school and begins to shoot? We are causing so much trauma to this generation of kids. We have to do something about it. And it is not having a one-door policy, as some senators have.
The fire marshal, no, that's not, it's not arming teachers.
It's not arming teachers. I mean, we don't even pay teachers enough to educate. I mean, what?
No. Well, and I have, I come from a family of educators. I also went to school to be an educator. So a lot of my, college friends and stuff are teachers. So they fill my newsfeed and they're saying things like, you won't even let us select our own library books. You won't even let us control our own thermostats.
Right.
And you want to arm us?
Yep.
Please.
Exactly.
Please make it make sense.
And my dear mother, Jennifer Randall.
Oh, yeah.
Who's a saint. I love her.
Truly.
She
I've met you and your brother. She's a saint.
Hey. She is a wonderful, beautiful human being. And she was a public educator for over 3 decades, a principal for half of that time. And I love her dearly. I don't want Jennifer Randall having a firearm in a situation like that. And she doesn't want one either.
No, I used to teach school and I cannot imagine. No. And the other, how do you keep it safe? How do you, and kids, okay, all the things, paper cutters. Paper cutters are about as violent as we need in the classroom. And even that I never had in mind because I could just see a little finger getting in there and we've got to keep our kids safe.
Yeah. And another talking point that we're seeing emerge from this, especially from the right, is that this is a mental health issue. And here's the deal. I agree that we've got a mental health issue in this country. A lot of the problems stem from those same individuals who have cut mental health programming time and time again. Governor Abbott really wanted to pin the Uvalde shooting on mental health. There's been no indication whatsoever that this individual had mental health issues in the past, but nonetheless, they attempted to do so. But in that same line, this governor also just months prior to this event cut state funding for mental health care. It's just asinine. Yes, we have a mental health issue in this country.
But
we
so
need to be
do
doing
every other country.
Exactly. Thank you.
We don't own the rights to mental health issues. We only own the rights to our guns.
Right. Exactly. And this only happens in America. Yes, there's an occasional shooting in other countries, but those are so few and far between. And when they do happen, such as in New Zealand or in Canada, those governments actually do something about it.
Yep.
But not here in America. It's like...
It's a money problem.
Yeah.
It's a money issue. It's a lobbyist, a money, NRA issue. And
and it's a patriarchal issue. I mean, I just think people think that they not only have a right to guns, even though what the Second Amendment actually says, it is the local militias have the right to bear arms. And I'm not against gun ownership. There's a lot of great gun owners out there that do some wonderful things and live their lives, and it's fantastic. But at the same time, there's no reason to have assault rifles in the public domain. None.
No.
Zero.
No.
And we've got to do something. Red flag laws in this country need to be established. Just this whole this toxic masculinity that somehow we look tough, or we're going to be the new Minutemen, or just the new militia for this age. It's just a bunch of nonsense. It's just like, you got a problem with your masculinity. You're trying to overcompensate for your lack of being a true human being, and it's just infuriating to me. So I hope
it's a guard against having to see your fellow human.
Right.
I've got this barrier between me and you, and I don't have to see you. I'm just going to shoot you in the face.
Yeah.
That's the American mentality. That it's just, I'm going to protect me and mine.
Yeah.
And where in the Bible does it ever talk about me and mine?
Yeah.
Where?
And it seems like, especially with all these stand your ground laws, and we know what's going on, or we know from evidence about what's going on with policing in this country. All you have to say is that I felt threatened, and you're justified in killing somebody. How do you prove that? How do you prove that you were truly threatened? And it just, we had a case here in Norman, Oklahoma, just several weeks ago, where a man was shot by an individual in the car, and the individual in the car said that they felt threatened. Well, there's really no evidence of that, of what level of threat that the person felt at. Was there a confrontation? Yeah, probably. But at what point does that need to turn lethal? And the DA here did not pursue any kind of charges because the man said he felt threatened. And so it's, we've got a huge problem we got to deal with. But America has been notorious for just kicking the can down the road when it comes to issues like this. We just don't want to deal with them. We just want to stay in our so-called utopia and continue to exist, but no longer.
I very briefly want to talk to you about people wrapping God up in this, because I see a lot of people saying things like, well, if America would just return to church, if we bring prayer back into school, if we would just return to God, this would go away. Or talking about how the breakdown of the nuclear family is the reason that we're having all of this happen. And I'm just here to say that in my opinion, I don't think God wants to be our scapegoat for this. And us partnering religion with public education is also not going to solve our gun issue. That's not the problem.
No, we do not. And the real issue we have is that Christian nationalism is ingrained into this culture, and especially those people who find themselves in positions of privilege think their way of life, their ideology, their economic status is a God-given right, and that nobody should be able to jeopardize that whatsoever, and that everybody should stay in their own lane in this country. And it's just absolutely asinine to try to tie God into this debate. I mean, if you're going to tie God into this, let's really tie the person that we call Lord into this conversation, and that's Jesus. And I already said that a moment ago. You cannot hold a gun advocacy position in this country and call yourself a follower of Jesus. I'm that adamant about it because Jesus was very clear when it came to rising up and using violence to solve issues. So I'm ready for a big change. I hope it's coming. There is a bipartisan effort taking place in the Senate right now. I have a little glimmer of hope, but you know how these things go. They could just talk it to death and nothing ends up happening. It's all semantics and imagery. But we've got to do something, folks, because we are doing our children an injustice by just closing our eyes again. So,
well, and time and time again, the gun was obtained legally.
Right. Yeah, legally.
So the laws need to change.
Yep.
The end.
The end. Absolutely. Well, Autumn, while you're away in Hawaii enjoying your best life, I sat down with Tim, Alberta. Tim is a staff writer for The Atlantic. He used to be the chief political correspondent for Politico. He recently wrote an article in May entitled How Politics Poison the Evangelical Church. And he sat down with some of these religious right leaders and interviewed them and talked to them about their beliefs and what they were touting from the pulpit. And it was a very, very interesting interview. It's a great article. I encourage you to go read it in The Atlantic right after you listen to this interview as I sat down with Tim, Alberta. Stay tuned.
Marvel at Pacific Coast Wells. Wonder in rainforests. Explore wild coastlands and towering cliffs. Join Good Faith Media for a unique and immersive experience in the Pacific Northwest and Olympic National Park. Enjoy engaging conversation with your small group of adventurers led by our team, which includes a journalist, historian, and theologian. Join us July the 23rd through 30th. Learn more at faithexperiences.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got Tim Alberta with us. He is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and staff writer for The Atlantic magazine. He formerly served as chief political correspondent for Politico. In 2019, he published the critically acclaimed book, American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump. Earlier this month, on May 10th, Tim published an article in The Atlantic entitled, How Politics Poison the Evangelical Church. He's here with us today to discuss that article and his observations regarding faith and politics. Tim, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Mitch, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Well, Tim, before we get into some of the specifics about the article, first of all, congratulations, not only on the article, I've worked through it a number of times. The interviews were great. The observations that you made were just accurate, knowing, because I grew up in the evangelical church. And so, everything that was in the article, I was just saying, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've seen it. I've heard it. But before we get into those specifics, let me just ask you, can you describe to our listeners what prompted you to research and write this article?
Well, I too grew up in the evangelical church. I am a PK. Dad was a minister in the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and which is a smaller denomination. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Pretty conservative theologically, culturally, politically. Very white. Certainly my home church in Brighton, Michigan, very white, almost exclusively white. And so that was sort of the environment that I was steeped in growing up. My mother worked at the church also. And so I sort of physically grew up in the church. I spent my nights and summer vacations there, playing hide and seek. And as I got older, playing tag and stuff. I actually worked at the church as a janitor when I was going to community college. So I was very much marinating in church culture, in church life for the entirety of my upbringing. And I had just really, long before I got into political journalism, long before I started writing professionally about the influence of American evangelicalism in the political space, I just had questions for myself about what I was seeing in the church and some of the trade-offs that were being made, some of the sacrifices that were apparent, particularly when it came to decisions around politics and around culture and what to engage with and what not to engage with and why and what the stakes were. And there were just things that had been unresolved in my mind and questions that were sort of looming larger and larger the older I got and the more involved the more involved that I became with covering politics as a profession. And so the time was right, particularly given the fact that I think over the last 4 or 5 years, as I write about in the piece, this confluence of events, everything from Me Too and questions of sexual abuse and cover-ups and accountability to George Floyd and racism and racial reconciliation, and then COVID and masks and vaccines and shutdowns of churches, and then of course Trump as sort of the backdrop to all of it and the divides in the church. It just felt like the turmoil was really intensifying, and that the time was right to do this.
It's interesting. We've interviewed a lot of journalists over the last several years since launching this podcast, and all of our journalists and some of our pastors who write for us have similar stories of growing up in the evangelical church and, witnessing firsthand what has transpired in the evolution of evangelicalism to the point of where it is today. And so, everything you just said really resonates with me as an inspiration to research this and write about it in a professional format. So let's go to the article in The Atlantic, May 10th, How Politics Poison the Evangelical Church. During your research for the article, you interview 3 pastors in their congregations that made it into the article. I'm sure you probably talked to others along the way as well. But the 3 pastors in their congregations are Pastor Bill Bolin of Floodgate Church in Brighton, Michigan, Pastor Ken Brown of Community Bible Church in Trenton, Michigan, and Pastor Greg Locke of Vision Bible Church in Wilson County, Tennessee. So in this research that you did in preparing for the article, here's the question. Because a lot of times, for those of us who have come out of evangelicalism, and for me in particular, who now really denounce a lot of their theological and political activity, I think sometimes we forget about their humanity. And so when you sat down with these pastors in their congregations, let me ask you this. What similarities and differences did you notice between the 3 pastors and their congregations?
Sure. Well, there's a quite a spectrum here.
Well, let's start with the similarities. What similarities did you find?
Yeah. Well, I think even in exploring a church like Global Vision out in Tennessee, where Greg Locke is the pastor, I had a long conversation with Greg Locke, and there were parts of that conversation that would be totally normal, totally recognizable, totally consistent with conversations you might have with any other Christian pastor, any other, certainly an evangelical pastor, just about, about the role that, faith has played in his sort of, in his personal journey and why he's doing what he's doing and why he believes in what he's doing. And that's without even getting into any of the specifics politically or theologically or otherwise, just sort of testimonial content that would feel consistent with. And so that was, and that was the experience at the other churches as well. And to your point with the, I think I quote at the end of the day 4 or 5 pastors in the piece, but that's drawn from dozens and dozens of interviews with pastors in different places, and I think that the similarities there are, at the end of the day, I do think, and maybe this is just my wanting to give the benefit of the doubt to anybody who works in the clergy, but at the end of the day, I think the similarities, all these guys profess to love Jesus, and they think that they're doing what is right by him and by their congregants, by their communities. Right. And obviously I can and do disagree with the approach in some instances, but I think the similarity is I think these guys do have more in common than one might suspect, right. Just from sort of looking at the pictures or kind of reading the takeaways. And then, as far as differences, as there's such a spectrum now when we think about, even within the white evangelical church. I was just at a church last night in Ohio, in fact, where doing some additional reporting, where you have people in the same pews. You've got guys who are wearing suits and ties and who are very buttoned up, and he's sitting 2 or 3 people away from a guy who's wearing an American flag shirt with an eagle holding the Constitution. And, those 2 guys are in the same pews, they're worshiping together, right. But chatting with them afterwards, they are completely different human beings. And they've got remarkably different views on the intersection of faith and politics and what brought them to church on this Monday night for this event that I was attending. So the differences are vast, mm-hmm. but one would like to think that at least one core similarity, one core commonality does exist, and that's Jesus.
And that's fascinating because I've talked to a lot of fundamentalist right-wing evangelicals who tout a lot of conspiracy theories and theological positions that I would deeply disagree with. But when you talk about life, when you talk about, marriage, and you talk about family, and you talk about, just paying the bills and what's going on in their neighborhood, I mean, there is a human connectivity there that I think oftentimes we forget about. And so leads into the next question, because these are human beings. They're flesh and blood, just like you and I are, but they are susceptible to these conspiracy theories, and they advocate for such extreme causes. What do you think in your time with these individuals and their congregations opens them up to be so accepting of these conspiracy theories and advocating for such extreme measures?
It's a great question, and something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and asking these individuals about. In fact, I had one of the pastors, Ken Brown, who's sort of a small C conservative, but politically very buttoned up, and has really, as I described in the piece, really made an effort to sort of rein in his congregation and make sure that he's keeping conspiracies and disinformation out of the church, because he views them as a serious threat to the mission of the church. Ken said to me at one point, he said, I've had conversations with some leaders in the church where we've kind of wondered aloud to one another, is there something about us as believers in Christ that makes us more susceptible to conspiracy theories? In other words, one might study us from the outside and say, well, these guys believe that the son of a carpenter in the Middle East 2,000 years ago hung from a tree and then pushed a boulder away and rose from the dead 3 days later, and then ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the creator of the heavens and earth. Of course they believe in QAnon.
Right, yeah.
Right. Of course, they believe the election was stolen. Of course, and that's an interesting question. And I'm not, I personally am not terribly well appointed to get into, some of the epistemological distinctions here. But I see the point that he was raising, and frankly, it's a conversation I've had with other pastors. I would attack it slightly differently, though. I would attack the question slightly differently, Mitch. I think, in all of my reporting, the common thread that I come back to time and again in so many of these conversations with folks is a sense of America in decline, America under siege, America, this blessed and special, exceptional country that has been that has had God's hand on it from the beginning, that it is slipping away. And I emphasize that point because once someone believes that the nation is slipping away, and that an attack on the nation is an attack on God, and vice versa, I do believe that sort of opens the door to more radical thinking, both politically and theologically, frankly. I talked to a couple of people in the piece who give voice to that, this idea that there's no longer a meaningful distinction between the political and the spiritual, that it's all wrapped up in the same warfare. And if you get to that place, which, trust me, I've talked with an awful lot of folks, I'm sure you have as well, who are in that place, I think once you're there, it's really not much of a leap to buy into any of these conspiracies, that the election was stolen, or that the vaccine is designed to control the population, or any of these things. I mean, it's not a big leap at that point.
So, Tim, let's follow up on that, because we do hear that a lot, that the country is going to hell in a handbasket. It's in severe decline, morally, spiritually. But here's reality. That argument has been made for 200 years now. Each error, especially from the right-wing populace of the country, always argues that the country is heading in the wrong direction or in decline, which often translates into I'm losing power and influence and wealth because of the advancement of other people in the world. Again, we've heard it since the beginning of this country. Is there anything different specifically about this current era and this current argument that delineates it from those other moments in history where we have heard make America great again, or take your country back, or the country's in severe decline spiritually. Is there some, because to be honest with you, I can't put my finger on it, but this feels a lot different than these past moments in recent history.
So I'll give you two different answers here. I'll give you my perspective on it, and then I'll try to channel the perspective of a lot of folks I've had this conversation with. So my own perspective is that it does feel different, sort of objectively, and institutionally it feels different because our institutions are in fact sort of in serious decline. And, the decades-long downward trajectory of the public's confidence in everything from the institution of the church to the institution of law enforcement, the financial system, Congress, the media, don't get me started, all the way up and down the line, Major League Baseball, right? We don't believe in anything anymore. We don't believe that the people in charge have our best interests in mind. And that is toxic to an experiment in self-government like ours. When we cease to believe that the people who should be looking out for us are in fact looking out for us, it's a disease that spreads. And I think we're seeing that. And the church is just, one of many examples where you can see folks turning on one another and refusing to buy in anymore to this belief that things are going to be okay. This idea that, it's cyclical, we're America, we've been through this before, we'll go through it again, and we ultimately pull through. People aren't buying that like they used to, and I'm not sure that I'm buying it, frankly. So I can appreciate where they're coming from. Now, to the second part is, I would say that in the conversations I have with a lot of individuals, when you say, well, what is different about this moment? I think that they would make the case that you can sort of quantify and qualify the country's moral decline, as you put it a moment ago, and they would point to everything from pornography consumption to same-sex marriage being legalized, to abortion rates, to the public education system indoctrinating children. And I mean, they could sort of rattle off the greatest hits of the culture wars and say, not only are we losing all of these culture wars, but we've sort of reached a place where our backs are against the wall, where there's really no fighting leverage to be had. And I think that's what feels different to them. As I write about in the piece, even during the heyday of the moral majority, when we were going to hell in a handbasket, I think there was actually a significant amount of optimism that the fight could still be turned around and that righteousness could still prevail. I think what's different now, Mitch, in a lot of these conversations, as I say in the piece, there is a fatalism that underpins a lot of these conversations. In other words, a lot of folks believe that the fight is lost, that it can't be turned around anymore, and that now it's just sort of this, well, this is our Alamo moment for a lot of evangelicals. And that to me does feel very different.
Yeah. The way, just assessing that and reading the piece and I really appreciated Kim Brown. I mean, I thought he's making a good faith effort to try to combat conspiracy theories, but hearing the other pastors that you interviewed, especially Bolin and Locke, I was just reminded that it's almost as though they are fighting tooth and nail to keep control of the meta-narrative and the specific narrative of their existence, and that those two are not delineated, because as the narrative changes, as they become less dominant in culture, in politics, in their communities, the less control they feel like they have, and the lesser they feel as an individual. And it's hard to convince them otherwise. Just because somebody else, now has more rights than they did before, doesn't mean that they have any less rights. And so for me, it culminated on January 6th, obviously, of 2021. And just all of a sudden, all of this rhetoric that I have heard all of my life from pastors such as you interviewed for the piece, all of a sudden that rhetoric turned into physical action. And we saw a storming of the Capitol primarily by Christian nationalism that was fueled by evangelical theology and politics. And it was like, oh, they not only feel this and are talking about it, now they are ready to act. Now, what was interesting about that, Tim, is that that came from the white church. The black church has been saying, yeah, we've been feeling the sting of this rhetoric all of our lives through generation upon generation. But it just seems like all of a sudden we are at this point in history where everything is culminating together, and it's frightening. And in fact, I was reading a book just recently about the politics of the last couple of years, and the author was interviewing members of the Republican Party who were frightened because some of their colleagues are outwardly talking about civil war now. And it's just really frightening. So I guess my next question for you is this. What do you think the end game is for these pastors? We know they're doing this out of deep theological convictions. And even though we disagree with them, they have their convictions. But what are they hoping to achieve? And it's kind of like the question, what does make America great again mean? What period of time are we talking about in the again? What is their ultimate goal?
I think it follows from the answer I gave a moment ago in talking about the decline of America and sort of the inexorable trajectory that we find ourselves on in the view of some of these folks.
So I realize that they, let me rephrase that. I realize that evangelicals make this prognosis of what is going on in the country, and a lot of that's what drives them. But what is their ultimate goal? Is it to take control of government? Is to purge the country of liberals, of pagans? What are they after?
Yeah, no, I think that if you are going to put yourself in their shoes, and if you are going to subscribe to the idea of America in sort of terminal decline, and that the trajectory cannot be bent back in the other direction, and that some of these sort of culture wars are in fact lost, then you are going to start thinking about you're sort of a survivalist mode, more or less. So no, I don't think it's about a purge. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's about going on offense. I think it's about almost bunkering down a little bit and trying to carve out a space in which you can exist the way that you want to exist, and you can worship the way that you want to worship, and that you can continue to grow a community of like-minded individuals that can sort of occupy a space that is untouched by the secularization of the culture all around you. In other words, I think my sense from a lot of these conversations is that for many of these folks, it really is less about going on offense at this point, and a little bit more about sort of digging their trenches, because they feel like the forces of liberal, secular America are coming for them. Mm-hmm. And I want to be clear that to the extent that violent and militaristic rhetoric animates parts of this movement, it is, in my experience anyway, it is almost entirely defensive. It is this idea that they don't want to have to do this, but they might have to at some point because people are coming for them. So that's an answer that may surprise some people. But again, I'm a reporter. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a pollster, and I'm not certainly not a psychic. But based on all of my reporting, what I find time and time again is that the end game in the eyes of I think a significant number of the people who we're talking about here, sort of right-wing white evangelicals who have some sort of apocalyptic notions of the end of America, it really does seem to focus their end game around ideas of sort of established safe havens where big bad government and big bad secular culture can't touch them.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's what we hear here at Good Faith Media, is that it seems as though there is a creation of a narrative, if there's elements of truth to it, or if there's not elements of truth to it, that has been created in the mindset of some evangelicals, that there's this mythological big bad wolf coming after them to destroy them and their way of life. And therefore, they've got to do everything in their power to fight against that mythology. So, I hear what you're saying. Now, what surprised you when you sat down with these pastors? Was there one moment during your research and interviews that just really surprised you after talking to these folks?
Well, yeah, there were a few. I mean, I had a long conversation, as I think I mentioned earlier, with Greg Locke, who seems like almost on a weekly basis is making national news headlines for comments he's making about just recently, you ain't seen an insurrection yet. Month or two before that, it was, saying that he found witches in his congregation, that, during an exorcism, a demon told him about witches in his congregation. Before that, they were having a bonfire of Harry Potter books to try and destroy the occult. I mean, he's got a talent for keeping himself in the bloodstream. I was really surprised that in a lengthy conversation with Greg Locke, he was quite introspective, quite reflective on some things that he felt like in hindsight that he'd done wrong, that he'd been too reactionary, that he'd been too political, that he hadn't thought certain things through, and that he worried that it was harming the gospel and his ability to evangelize. I was sort of floored by some of the comments he made to me in that respect. So that's one example. I had some encounters, some conversations, some experiences with pastors in different parts of the country that never made the cut for the piece, just because there's only so much you can write. It was already 10,000 words, and you just sort of have to start cutting somewhere. And so I did a year's worth of reporting for the piece. And I'll tell you that some of the most just jaw-dropping conversations I had with pastors were the ones where they would tell me about experiences in their church over the last couple of years, whether it was in reaction to the church closing because of COVID-19, or because of the pastor handing the pulpit over to a Black colleague in the wake of George Floyd's murder, or some other kind of cultural touchstone moment where people in their church who'd been there for 15, 20, 25 years, close personal friends, in some cases, people who'd been elders at the church, basically formed lynch mobs and came after the pastor, and didn't do it listen, you and I both know that churches have their own sort of political and governance struggles all the time, and that's nothing new, just read the New Testament. But some of these anecdotes were genuinely astonishing. I mean, we're talking about physical intimidation. We're talking about psychological warfare. We're talking about really nasty vitriolic campaigns waged over social media, some of them employing Photoshop to to try and intimidate
Right.
or
Yeah. There's a story about that in
the
the article.
yeah,
About
I mean,
Photoshop.
just really things that would leave you. Let me put it this way, Mitch. The sort of behavior that if you saw it in a corporate setting would leave you chilled, and you'd think, "Wow, this is horrible behavior. How could you treat another person this way?" Much less in a church setting, right? And I got to say, that's what surprised me, and it shouldn't have, because again, I'd grown up in this movement, and I'd seen some of it for myself, and I guess I just didn't suspect that it was happening at the scale that, in fact, it is happening.
So just sitting there listening you describe all of this stuff, and even in your previous answers to the questions, something comes to mind, and I just want to just flat out ask you. Is this white supremacy 2.0? Because everything you described to me resonates with what happened in the South during Jim Crow towards the African American community. But now it is expanded to not only the Black community, but also to secularism, Democrats, liberals, progressives, people from the LGBTQI community. It seems like white supremacy has gotten a booster, so to speak, and has repackaged itself. And this is what we've got, because it's this intimidation, it's the supremacy of culture and religion, and that they're in this eternal battle to keep up their values and morals, and they are very specific in how they articulate that. But at the end of the game, it's for them to stay supreme in the culture and to everybody else be subservient to their way of life.
Well, let me give you a nuanced answer. You know, I'm constantly reminding myself in doing this reporting that we're talking about, with white evangelicals, we're talking about tens of millions of people. Right. And so certainly they are not a monolith. Certainly there is real diversity of views, theologically and politically and otherwise. Now, it might not be, a vast diversity, but generally, I don't think generalizations are helpful. I will say that there's no question that when you dig into the mentality that is shared by some of the folks who are really on the front lines of this, and really the most active and the most aggressive, that there is a sort of supremacist mindset, and it's cultural, it's political, it's theological. I think to some extent it's racial, for sure. Again, these things are hard to quantify. What I'll say, though, is that those folks on the front lines are so oftentimes punching above their weight. What I mean by that is, in all of the anecdotes that I was conveying just a moment ago, without fail, every single time when I'd be having this conversation with one of these pastors, I'd say, so how many people are we talking about here? These guys who sort of formed a lynch mob and came after you and made things horrible inside your church, and in some cases succeeded in driving you or driving other people out of the church. How many people are we talking about? And without fail, the answer would be 7 or 8, 9 or 10, right? And oftentimes this is in a church of 3 or 4 or 500.
Wow. Which
makes you, it makes you think two things. Number one, makes you think, wow, that's real minority power. That's an ability of those loudest voices to really dominate the conversation to get what they want. But then secondly, it makes you realize, well, just how much of a minority are they? Because if the other folks are so opposed to what they're doing, then why aren't they doing something about it? Right. So I do think they're a minority, but again, how do you quantify it? How do you measure it? I don't know the answer. And I think that has been the source of a lot of dissatisfaction and disillusionment and frankly, heartbreak for a lot of these pastors who have asked themselves that same question.
Right.
If this is just 7 or 8 people in my congregation who are sort of off the reservation and who've decided to wage war against me because I said something from the pulpit they didn't like, or I invited a guest speaker who challenged their political assumptions, right? If it's just these 6 or 7 or 8 people in the congregation doing this, but I've been here faithfully serving for a decade or two, and all of these other folks know me and know my heart and know my family and appreciate the work I do, why aren't they standing up for me? Why aren't they pushing back more forcefully against these others?
Sure.
And that's where things really, I think, get tragic at a certain level for a lot of the pastors involved.
Right. So we always like to end these interviews with trying to find some kind of hope in these very difficult topics that we discuss. And reading your piece and the article in the Atlantic, How Politics Poison the Evangelical Church, I found it in Pastor Brown. He and I would probably disagree on a lot of theological points and political points, but I think he's making a good faith effort to bring some sensibility and calmness to his congregation. Is there hope out there, Tim? I mean, you've interviewed some of these controversial pastors and you've heard a lot of their rhetoric and inside their congregations and what's going on. Where is the hope that you see? Or is there hope, I guess I should say?
Well, listen, I mentioned in the piece early on, the first Bible verse I ever memorized, first passage of scripture I ever memorized as a kid was 2 Corinthians 4:18. We set our sights not on what we can see, but on what we can't see, because what we can see is temporary and what we can't see is eternal. And it's such a as a writer, I just so appreciate the turn of phrase there. We set our sights on what we can't see, right? It's an oxymoron.
Right.
But it's so profound and so beautiful. And so I think the hope is in what we can't see. If I were to just obsess over everything I can see inside these churches, and in the culture more broadly, in the way in which American evangelicalism is sort of driving so much of our cultural and political polarization, then I would feel hopeless. But if I remind myself daily, which I try to do, that I'm supposed to be setting my sights on what I can't see, then there's a lot of hope. And the hope is that Jesus is still on the throne and that he loves me despite the fact that I'm the worst sinner of all and that I don't deserve it, and that I'm straying from the path every day and fighting to get back on it, and that he's walking beside me the same way that he's walking beside a lot of these other terribly flawed individuals. And that's the hope. There's always hope. It's just hard to find when your eyes aren't fixed on the right thing.
That's great. What a great answer. Thank you so much for giving us some hope. Tim Alberta, he is a staff writer for The Atlantic. His latest article is his latest article is How Politics Poison the Evangelical Church. His most recent book is American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump. Tim, it has been a joy having you with us today. We want to encourage everybody to subscribe to The Atlantic. You can read much more of Tim in The Atlantic. He's a great writer, great author. So make certain you subscribe and give him a read. But before we let you go, Tim, we've got one question that we ask every one of our guests. Most times, Autumn, my co-host, asks this question, but she is suffering for Jesus in Hawaii right now. And so I get the distinct pleasure of answering this. At Good Faith Media, our tagline is, "There is more to tell." So in light of everything we talked about here today, Tim, Alberta, what is your more to tell?
Boy, after the tone and tenor of this conversation, dare I get into sports where I'm a lifelong diehard Detroit sports fan, and these are the dark days, the dark ages for Detroit sports. So that might be the only subject matter that's more depressing than the American church.
I'm a Red Sox fan, so we're just hovering below 500 right now. But we won 5 in a row, so
you've got some hardware from recent years to show for all of your efforts. More to tell. I would say that we should keep a close eye on what's happening in this political environment. This is a very strange midterm election cycle shaping up, and I'm a political junkie, and I've tried to spread my wings a bit at the Atlantic and not just write about politics anymore, and had some success doing so. But I'm sort of dialing back in now, given that we're approaching this midterm election in November, and you've got all of these incredible headwinds facing the Democratic Party. Everything from inflation to immigration to crime, and just the fundamentals of a midterm election. President's 2 years in, and his party is going to suffer because of it. We see that historically. Everything imaginable is working against the Democratic Party, and yet you have Republicans in some states that are really attempting to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory here, and are nominating some individuals who are, in many cases, they're going to test whether they are electable even under the best of circumstances. Folks who are conspiracy theorists, folks who are election fraudsters, folks who are being very open about their intention to use their office to subvert democratic norms in this country. And it's going to be fascinating to see this collision of forces. On the one hand, a Democratic Party that is really hemorrhaging support and facing, as I said, just sort of in many ways historic headwinds in this election cycle, pitted against a Republican Party that seems intent on testing this proposition of just how far to the right somebody can be and still win a general election come November. So it's just a fascinating thing to keep an eye on. I'd encourage everybody to tune in.
Stay engaged, folks. You heard it from Tim, Alberta. Make certain you educate yourself because there is an important election. No matter how you vote, make sure you get out and vote your conscience, and continue the political dialogue. I mean, that's what this country is about dialogue, and hopefully trying to find some compromise so that we can move the country forward. And so, Tim, it's been a joy. Thank you so much for joining us at Good Faith Weekly.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in this week. Hopefully next week, Autumn's going to be back from Hawaii and talking right here at Good Faith Weekly. And until then, keep living good faith.